Welcome to the Sourcing Industry Landscape Podcast, powered by SIG.org and hosted by Dawn Tiura.
Well, folks, welcome back to the podcast series, and I'm so excited about the topic of today's podcast. It's one of my favorite topics. But before we jump into it, let me introduce to you who's in the studio today. So with me today is Matt Kruse. Now, he's a director over at ProcureAbility, and he has over 2 decades of experience in procurement across both corporate and consulting sectors. He has led and supported multiple engagements for Fortune 1000 companies, as well as having supported efforts led by private equity investment. Now, Matt has supported multiple industries throughout his career, including retail, manufacturing, hospitality, consumer packaged goods, and healthcare. By combining his corporate experience and consulting, he can translate strategies into actionable plans and drive measurable results to the bottom line. Now, he also holds a bachelor's degree in communications from Texas Tech University and an MBA from Regis University in Denver, Colorado, as well as a Lean Six Sigma belt certification. He lives in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex with his wife and son. So, Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dawn. Very excited to be here. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
I'm excited too. But before we get started, we're going to take a break and get a word in from our sponsor. And when we come back, we're going to talk about tail spend, which is one of my favorite subjects with Matt. So we'll be right back.
Sourcing Industry Group, or SIG, is the premier global sourcing association and is widely known as a forum for providing thought leadership, networking, and training opportunities. Another central element of SIG is training. SIG is the parent organization for SIG University, which was founded on the ideals of elevating sourcing and risk professionals to deliver strategic value to their organizations and transform their careers. It was created at the request of SIG members who saw an educational training gap for today's workforce and offers one-of-a-kind certification and training programs for professionals seeking deep expertise in sourcing, governance, risk, intelligent automation, and more for themselves and for their teams. We perfected e-learning for adults before it was necessary. Our proven model for adult learners provides a flexible environment with online lessons, quizzes, and discussion forums moderated by expert faculty. Programs are offered in several different delivery models depending on you or your organization's need. Open cohort semesters start on average every 1.5 months, while closed cohorts for teams of 20 or more can start at any time. In addition, we also have self-paced or fast-track options. You can learn more about all of these offerings on the SIG website or by reaching out to one of our representatives. So make sure to take advantage of all that SIG has to offer for both members and non-members alike, because there really is something for everyone.
Okay, Matt, maybe not everyone in the world is as passionate about tail spend as I am. So can you, for our audience, just describe what is tail spend? And more specifically, why should you give a darn and take a proactive approach to managing it?
Certainly. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a term that was coined, I think, most important to kind of identify and detail high volume, low value purchases. So things that are not glamorous, that don't kind of drive the needle day in, day out, but that are critical and yet frequently neglected aspects of procurement management. So typically, tail spend often accounts for a very large majority of the total number of transactions, but it's a small fraction of that total spend. So while each individual transaction might not move that needle, the cumulative impact actually can be pretty significant on a company's financial health and certainly their operational efficiency. Really what that ultimately leads to then is that aggregate impact can lead to higher processing costs, reduced bargaining power, an increase in supplier management complexity, and probably most important, a higher risk exposure for the organization.
Absolutely. I was waiting for you to say the word risk, because that screams risk to me.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
And I know, historically, all my life in procurement, tail spend has been, like, why bother? It's a $10,000 agreement, it's a $100,000 agreement, it's a one-time off, one-time buy. And it wasn't sexy. And,
Right.
I'd much rather be sourcing the $100 million engagement.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. And I could make a bigger impact. So my argument always historically was, forget it. If it's not a huge amount of our spend. But boy, with the risk it introduces now that we were never thinking about, 15, 20 years ago.
Exactly right.
It's just crazy. So not only do you have the maverick spend, rogue spending, all that, but you have so much risk. So
Yes.
if I remember correctly, the tail spend is when people talk about the long tail, It's if you do a Pareto diagram
Correct.
of all of your spend, it's the stuff that peters out at the end. Smaller and
That's
smaller
exactly
and
right.
smaller agreements, but lots of them. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And it's, the threshold varies from company to company. I think kind of industry standards, we think about it, it's about $50,000 in annual spend with any one supplier. But again, that is very specific to each, certainly each industry and each company. They kind of have to set your own threshold, which that's really kind of a first step in entirely management, of tail spend, is understanding what constitutes tail spend in your organization. But you're exactly right. If you think of a Pareto, it's that long tail at the end where the money just keeps going and going and going. The count on suppliers keeps going and going. And yes, it's not glamorous, and no one really enjoys focusing on it because it's impactful as a whole, but it's not impactful individually, right? And so you don't get the glamour from it when you're trying to source those categories or suppliers.
I want to go for the big percentage savings.
Yes,
that translates to the big dollars. But so when you talk about it now, it's hard to manage for so many companies, and there's so many challenges for them. They can't get their arms around it. So can you sort of share what you see out in the field as to why people are having problems with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's four primary reasons that really drive just kind of the complexity or the unwillingness really to dive into it. The first and foremost is just going to be the lack of visibility, right? It's a challenge to kind of go through and segment what the spend is, where it's occurring, who the suppliers are. So that lack of visibility is difficult. You've got high transaction costs associated with it. We mentioned the Maverick or Rogue spend and the supplier compliance. The biggest, I think, hurdle for any organization is just the disparate data sources that you have across all of that spend and the very manual processes, because typically the spend's occurring at different levels within the organization. And there's just no adherence to any kind of procurement policies or procedures that may be in place on those larger categories and larger spend, but these things are just kind of passing through. So you have that administrative cost of just processing that low value transaction, and it's disproportionately high to that transaction value. But those kind of four segments are really what make it a challenge and a difficulty for organizations to really get their hands around it.
Well, I know it always has been, but we have to do something different now. So
yeah.
If you're looking at tail spend with an organization and you're looking at let's say you've done a spend cube or spend analytics, do you try and account for tail spend when you're doing the spend overview for them?
Certainly, we do, absolutely, as an organization. And I think anyone that's not is falling extremely short. It goes back to, like we said, it's not glamorous, and yes, it can be very tactical. But if you don't have a fundamental understanding of where that money is going, it will just kind of continue to cycle into perpetuity, right? And so you never have a full control or full understanding of what your spend is. And again, going back to the risk, right? You continue to expose yourself to that risk, and that only increases over time. And you don't have the appropriate compliance, governance, and controls in place to appropriately manage the entirety of your indirect spend. So yes, it absolutely must be included in any kind of spend cube. If you're doing a true spend assessment and you really want to know where the money's going and ultimately how it's being spent and where it's being spent.
Which when people say, well, I got about 80% of my spend calculated and I know where it is, but the other 20% is so hard to get to.
Yes.
And then they stop.
Yep.
So it just drives me nuts. So do you have any real world examples that you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one I think is unique in the sense just from the kind of size and scope of this one, but it's a perfect example because again, it really, I think, illustrates the point and the urgency to get your hands around. So we had a former client of ours was a giant in the retail space, global retail client. They actually had a procurement budget in the billions exclusively for indirect spend. So nothing on the direct side, purely indirect spend. Budget was in the billions. The budget was so large that they actually considered $1 million in annual spend with a single supplier as their tail spend threshold. So if you remember what I said earlier, most organizations, it's about 50,000 tends to be that threshold. For these guys, it was $1 million. So can't overstate how massive a threshold that was. And as you can imagine, they had significant challenges with the management of that tail, given just the overall size, scope, and scale. So most of it was wrapped up in MRO supplies, office supplies, other low-cost items from a large number of suppliers. So again, it's these kind of day in, day out purchases. Nothing glamorous. They're not, I think the issue for most organizations, they view it as this is not something that moves us forward. And so we're not concerned with it. But again, when you just think about the scale associated with this type of example, you can start to really quickly understand where the opportunity is to pull those levers. So they had significant issues with supplier fragmentation. You can imagine, obviously working on thousands of suppliers for small, infrequent orders led to a lack of visibility with purchases scattered across the organization and departments. So again, you had individuals not adhering to any type of policy or procedure. They're just placing orders as needed. So you get that inefficiency across those process and policies. You've obviously got an increase in administrative costs. And then, I thought about calling it a difficulty in supplier performance management. The reality is when you're buying like that at that level, it's an impossible task, right? You have no supplier management in place. So again, everything tying back to that risk exposure that they were understanding. So for us, as we started to go through our spend assessment, and like I said, this was a significant part of it, obviously, in recognizing just how much spend rolled into their total on tail. Really, it was taking that step and just analyzing the tail, right? Understanding where do those opportunities exist for kind of the down and dirty tactical supplier consolidation. As I mentioned, it's MRO supplies, office supplies. So there's nothing that's going to be categorically detrimental to the organization if you were to move from supplier to supplier. I don't think it matters, where we get our pen or our paper from. It's not anything that's going to necessarily change the overall aspects of the business. So that was step one, right? Where could we look to reduce the total number of suppliers, look to negotiate bulk contracts, then leverage those key suppliers with overall spend, driving better terms and pricing. So it's a very simple, tactical way to approach it, but you immediately start to recognize better supplier relationship management. You get a better handle over the terms and the pricing. So you're already starting to kind of create a bit of a organized or strategic approach to the spend. And then from there, we actually did the implementation of an e-procurement platform through a buy desk operation. So again, still kind of viewing it from a tactical lens, but putting that in gave us an immediate increase and visibility into tracking, visibility, as I mentioned, and that management of the tail. So now we know where it's going. As those purchases are being made, or if they're being requested, they had to flow through that buy desk so that it's not happening in more of a one-off manner from anywhere within the organization. So from that point, once you kind of get your arms around, how you want to do it with the e-procurement tool, buy desk, whatever functionality you want to go from there, we then start to assign specific categories to those existing and dedicated category managers. So now it does become a little more glamorous, right? It does become a part of their overall spend management. They have that responsibility. They can start to drive some of those efficiencies. So it ties back to that first step in leveraging the spend and the volume with those key suppliers, bringing it full circle and making it more transparent to the business and recognizing, the benefits from actually implementing a real strategy around the suppliers and the spend. So lastly, once you've kind of organized the spend, got it to assign category managers, the most important then is putting some stricter policies in place that actually require the departments to use those preferred suppliers, adhere to the negotiated contracts, and make sure now that the spend is actually funding through the appropriate channels. So taking those steps, results were obviously very straightforward. The savings were tens of millions of dollars. And again, simple stuff. It's MRO supplies, office supplies. There's nothing difficult or challenging about it. It was just getting your hands around it, taking the time to do it, and investing. I think that's the big thing is there is a time investment, but it's absolutely worth it. And it sets you up long-term. You now have strategy plans, category managers that are responsible for it. You've, I don't want to say eliminated the risk, but you've significantly reduced the risk and you now have visibility and tracking. So builds a stronger relationship with those key suppliers and ultimately drives some improved service. So it's a quick way to generate significant savings. And I use quick maybe in air quotes there because it does take some work and some wanting to do it. But if you do it, the results speak for themselves. I mean, I've never seen a tail spend program that didn't yield significant savings. Because if you stop and think about it, nothing's been done with it, right? It's greenfield spend. So the opportunities from savings are massive, right? Relative to the scale. But from a percentage standpoint, it's significant wins for the organization.
So I have a question for you. If you were with this company, did you not have an MRO category, or did you have an MRO category, but it excluded these small one-off buys?
That's exactly what it was. There was an MRO category, there was an office supply category, but again, because you've got $1 million threshold, anything that was falling below that, it just ended up in tail, and it didn't really have any rhyme or reason or organization to it, which again, as a procurement practitioner, you come into these situations and you kind of, you have to take a step back, and it's hard to believe, but a lot of organizations, I think, as they go, especially if they're in growth mode and really kind of, have difficulty just from a, bandwidth standpoint, do they have enough arms and legs to go after this stuff? I think a lot of it just kind of falls by the wayside, and it's in a number of cases, it's just kind of the way it's been for several years. And so then they never think to go back and reinvest or look at it. But yeah, it's interesting, right? That categories that you think fundamentally would have a category manager and some level of strategy assigned to them, because they fell below that threshold, they just lost the visibility.
Yeah, so I've always loved the maintenance, repair, and operating MRO category. Just a fun note, when I was sourcing up at Alyeska Pipeline, that category was referred to as rope, soap, and dope.
Oh, I like that. I might steal that. That's good. I like that one. Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, but I always remember telling people I was sourcing rope, soap, and dope, and they went like, "What?
What?
MRO." I was like, "Oh, okay." Okay, so now if we stop and we consider all the challenges and potential cost burdens to an organization, because they're going to look at that.
Yes.
Is there a strategic approach, or do you have an outline that you recommend that companies can do to really get their arms around their tail spend?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, we kind of hit already is, yes, it does take some work. There is going to be involvement, but it absolutely can be proactively managed, no matter how daunting we've maybe made it sound here in kind of the precursors we've gone through this. You absolutely can and should, I should say more pointedly, adopt a systematic category specific strategy to understand and address tail spend. I think that enhanced visibility, as we've talked about, it identifies areas that are ripe for improvement. You're going to generate cost savings at the same time. So not only are you improving just overall efficiencies within the organization, eliminating the risk, the cost saving opportunities are absolutely there. And typically when we approach it for the majority of our clients, we think about it, try to make it simple, candidly, right? Because it can seem to be a bit of a daunting task. So we typically do a kind of 4-pronged step-by-step approach. And we've hit on a few of these already, but really that first step is just managing and understanding through an analysis of the historical spend, right? It's really getting into the data cleansing, going through the collection, gathering all of that disparate spend we talked about earlier, right? So understanding how many different ERPs may be in use, how many different, whether it's data that's captured on spreadsheets that exist on desktops, whatever it is, we have to get our arms around that. So there's a real mining of data that takes place to understand where it is. And then from there, it's classifying that tail based on categories, right? So that we can start to drive some category management to it. Also looking at the suppliers, the frequencies of purchase. So we start to kind of triangulate around what those opportunities may look like. And then, as we mentioned, we have to determine what's going to constitute the threshold for tail spend. Like I said, majority of times it's 50,000 single supplier on an annual basis. But depending on the size of the organization, the overall volume of the spend, there could be some variance there. So that's working hand in glove, with the client to understand where that opportunity might be or what they might be comfortable with. I will tell you, more times than not, the client is usually looking to you to answer, right, what you think it should be. And so I think we ultimately end up usually in that $50,000 to $75,000 range, I think, on an annual basis. And so establishing that, then evaluating what that current supplier base and what opportunities for consolidation and rationalization exist. That's kind of paramount. Step one within step one is to really understand where do those opportunities exist to consolidate, rationalize. I'm sure you have too. You see in a lot of times tail spend, you'll run into scenarios where you literally have suppliers that's like a few $100s annually or a couple $1,000s annually. And you'll have some conversation like, oh, well, I'm worried about losing that supplier. It's like, why, right? It's a couple $100s, it's a couple that they probably don't even know that you're spending the money with them, right? So let's look at those opportunities to kind of standardize and drive some consolidation and rationalization. And then from there, obviously, is establishing that second step is looking to establish what are our policies going to be? What are the guidelines that are going to drive that proactive tail spend management? That obviously is going to ensure the procurement practices are standardized, they're strategic, and then most importantly, we're aligning with the organization's goals. So the whole thing is very much a collaborative approach. We don't like to kind of take it away, do it in a black box and say, this is your tail spend management program, because that's not going to work. You have to build this in unison. But I think most important is, it's where we really kind of step in, is to say, fundamentally, these are the best practices. This is our recommendation, the way we would go about doing it. We will build it and structure it for you, but we have to drive to a certain end, and we need you to kind of, partner with us as we go through that. And then making sure that internally the organization is communicating effectively what those policies and guidelines are going to be, and understanding that we know what the specific thresholds look like, what that criteria is for how to leverage and when to leverage those strategic sourcing practices, when to bring in the category managers that are now responsible for it. Probably should be brought in right from the very jump, since they now own what those high value purchases and complex categories. We're now bringing all of that together, so you've got that categorical management across the spend. So those are really the first two key steps that are done in conjunction with clients and developing what the tail spend looks like. And then ultimately, like we keep talking about, is the development of an actual strategic sourcing practice at the category level, where we can significantly enhance that tail spend management by leveraging the expertise of those category managers. Oftentimes, as you start to rationalize and consolidate, you're bringing spend back over to these category managers that they didn't know existed, or again, didn't think it was important. Now, as you start to do that rationalization and consolidation, they quickly start to assess what those opportunities look like and how they can drive and incentivize those category managers to route that tail spend to existing suppliers, creating better supplier management, again, getting away from the risk side of things. So it kind of feeds on itself, which is the really cool thing, is once you start to get that traction, it really picks up momentum. Category managers usually have a very positive reaction to it. You're growing their spend, right, which makes them a little more I don't want to call them important, right, but you give a little more visibility, let's say, to the category and the spend that's going through it, which creates a little more, as we talked about, a little more glamour to the indirect spend side. And then last is really comes down to the monitoring and measuring the performance, right? So you have to have the continuous monitoring, the measurement of the key performance metrics, understanding what that collaboration is between procurement, operations, and finance. And while that sounds maybe a little burdensome in saying you have to have the continuous monitoring and measurement, by doing that rationalization and consolidation and then putting some strategy alignment with the category managers around it, you effectively are driving the continuous monitoring from those actions, right? So it's not really a fourth step. It's a final step that's built off of all the work you've done previously. And then I think too, long-term, you have to think about, what do the thresholds look like long-term, right? And do we need to adjust those periodically based on changing business needs, market conditions, any procurement strategies that are being developed? So kind of just having an eye and a sense of, if we need to recalibrate what those might look like. But for us, that's kind of the 4-step approach we take. Again, they all kind of feed on one another. And then you kind of get this nice circular feedback loop, if you will, and drive some of the category management across all the tail.
No, I love that. So, and I don't think I think the worst thing about having a threshold, at least in my experience, has been that when you have a threshold, you just automatically allow yourself to ignore it. And, one of our famous examples here at SIG is we have a member who is a large casino brand, and they had a $10,000 fish maintenance program for a tank that they had in their lobby.
Sure, yeah.
And they didn't realize that the fish monitoring company was going to put in a thermometer to monitor the temperature, because they were expensive tropical fish. And that monitor, or that thermometer, was allowed to access their system, and they were hacked through a temperature gauge. So this was a $10,000 agreement, and I use this. Yeah, I use this to scare people, because who would have thought that fish have anything to do with IT or cybersecurity?
Very much so.
We just don't make those leaps. But, when you're introducing things like MRO and things like that, are they using RFID? Are they using some kind of tracking system? Are they going to, you all of a sudden take something that's a mundane category and add this whole layer of risk on that you would never have talked about if you weren't paying attention to these deals. And so I'm assuming that as you go through your construct of your 4 steps, and you look at your procurement policies, one of them would always be a cyber look at that category. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And you bring up an excellent point, because you think about how a number of these purchases, we talked about MRO and office supplies, they're through catalogs, right? Online catalogs that anyone has access to, right? So to your point, how easy is that? We go through all of our phishing and our spam and our IT security updates all the time. But you think about how many different people then have access to the catalog in and out. and what type of risk and cyber influence that can drive, the potential it's a little scary. And to your point, it's do you use it as a scare tactic? I say yes.
I say yes
because it's very much, it's a real thing. And especially the more people you have coming, like I said, in and out, using catalogs and having access, you're creating a number of different channels and backdoors for those nefarious characters, as they like to point out in the IT trainings, to certainly get access to it. Which
you sure do.
And then once they're in. You know that, right? They can go wherever they want. Yeah.
Yep, and they do. So Matt, thank you for talking about one of my favorite subjects, because I do scare people with it, because I want them. You've got to use tools. You've got to use, you've got to use your brains, and you've got to look at it. And I've seen so many issues, and I'll bet you even Target, who knows if that HVAC, supplier was in the tail. It might have been a small contract. We never talked about the size of that contractor. And who thinks that, air conditioning supplier HVAC has to log into your system?
Exactly.
And monitor. Exactly. So you just never think about it. But boy, and it's really changed with the cyber risk lately.
It has. And you bring up another great point on the HVAC side. I've seen that, right? You see facilities maintenance that if it falls below that threshold, it should be categorized in facilities maintenance and still captured, but it ends up in tailspin. And now, yes, you've got folks on the roofs, you've got all, so now you've got a whole other risk compliance issue that can be at your doorstep. So yeah, it is, like I said, and you brought it up early with the Pareto, and you look at it and it just looks like, oh my gosh, this tail goes forever. And there's so many suppliers and so much spend. But if you kind of just take a step back, we went through, the relatively short steps, and really, if you've got the right organization helping you, it's a relatively simple task that is going to drive. Absolutely, there are cost savings there, which I know are important for everyone. But really, at the end of the day, it's that supplier management and risk, again, that you're able to avoid and in most cases eliminate, that I think is most critical to businesses.
Yep. Well, for folks listening, obviously Matt knows this category, and ProcureAbility knows how to do this. So it's Matt at ProcureAbility that you should be getting hold of and putting as part of your network. So Matt, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dawn. Really appreciate it. It was a blast. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. And please make sure that you just keep tuning into our podcast. We publish new ones every week. And with that, have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Sourcing Industry Landscape podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. Want to nominate yourself or someone else for an interview? Email us at podcast@sig.org.